Fellow Huscarls, welcome to the Workshop of Odin. For our first episode, we'll be looking at Teutonic Knights. This is a fairly old kit, mostly presenting us with metal miniatures. They're quite heavy, the details aren't as great, but it still has a special place in my heart. The model we're going to choose is going to be a footman, armed with a shield and a spear. To begin our painting process, we will be using a light gray primer color. You can use either the one I'm using here, which is Grey Seer by Games Workshop, or Tamiya's Superfine Surface Primer Light Gray. Apply a zenithal highlight of a white primer of your choice. To paint the white, I'm going to use 4 colors as you see here. For our tools of the trade, we will need a pot of tap water, a wet palette, size 1 brush, in our case this is a regiment size brush from Army Painter, and a size 0 Kolinsky sable from Rosemary & Co. To start painting the white, we will use a wash made out of Lahmian Medium by Games Workshop and contrast paint Apothecary White. There's not really an alternative for Apothecary White, however you can try and mix your own gray wash, maybe use one from Vallejo. Mix in 2 parts Lahmian Medium to 3 parts Apothecary White. Lahmian Medium is needed here so we can dilute the wash a little bit more, thus reducing its strength so it doesn't stain as much. Since white is a very bright and difficult color to paint, we want as less tempering with it as possible. Apply the wash in thin layers, making sure it doesn't pool anywhere. However, I did let it pool towards the ends of the cape, but that wouldn't be as important later on. You don't want to dilute it too much since we still want it to have its effect of shading the white. However, don't leave it just straight out of the bottle as it will stain the white too much, making it difficult for us to layer the white on top. Here you can see the result. I've let the wash dry for about 30 minutes, and as I mentioned before, it did stain towards the bottom of the cape a little bit, but that's not a big issue. Next up, I'll be using a regimental sized brush from Army Painter to layer on Spaceship Exterior by Army Painter. This is a great off-white color that's not too gray, but it's also not white, giving us room for highlights. You want to dilute this paint around 2 parts water to 1 part paint, allowing us decent opacity, and at the same time it will be a see-through paint, which means we can layer it on for a smooth transition. The main goal when painting with white is to make sure your paints are properly thin, because white pigment is very hard to dilute and it can dry up in chunks, and we don't want that. We want a nice, crisp, smooth white. Here you can see me painting the white almost over the entire area, leaving our previous shade only in the recesses and shadows. Take your time with this step. This is the foundation for future work, so the neater you are, the more clean and crisp your white will look in the end. A good practice when painting with this technique is to leave your brush stroke where you desire the most pigment to end up in, so always paint in the direction of the light. As you can see me here, I leave my brush off the miniature at the point where I expect it to be the brightest. This will allow us to paint in nice transitions, making the effect look more natural and convincing. For the cape, paint the white color towards the end and top of the cape, kinda leaving less pigment in the middle. This will allow for a smooth transition. Also, pay attention to your brush strokes. Try to paint in one direction for a nice even application of white. For the feathers, you can either follow the pattern of the feather, painting away from where they insert into the helmet, or use the side of your brush to pick them out. If you're using the side of your brush, make sure your paint is a little bit less diluted and use gentle brush strokes to pick up the individual feathers. Repeat the process at the back of the helmet. For the shield, make sure you paint in single brush strokes going in the same direction to make sure the paint applies smoothly. This is a flat surface, so we want to make sure we don't leave any stain marks. For next step, I'll be using this interesting paint. it is a highly pigmented white from AK Interactive. Add it to our spaceship exterior in about a 2:1 ratio, 2 being spaceship exterior, 1 being white. Using a highly pigmented white paint allows us to make smoother transitions to avoid those infamous white chalking. And now we're gonna apply this only towards the most brightest areas, so make sure you paint towards the tops of the folds and the most visible parts of the white. Keep this paint more diluted than not. You can always apply more layers, however you won't be able to take away layers that you've already applied. Also, you can glaze this color in to the shadows to make the transition a bit smoother. Glazing is just a fancy word for a very diluted paint that you apply in an area, so just dilute your mix a little bit more and paint it into the shadows, but make sure it's super thin where you risk losing that contrast. Finish painting the remaining parts of the white, always leaving your brush stroke at the place of the most light that you expect. For the feathers, reduce the highlight area, mostly painting the tips of the feathers and not touching anywhere near the helmet. Take your time when painting with this technique. You want to make sure you apply even and careful layers around all of the details. Painting white means you have to be very careful with your paint application. Be very neat and it will look great. The final step in painting our white cloth is to make a glaze by using a glaze medium, in this case Lahmian Medium by Games Workshop, and our pure white color. We will glaze this towards the highlights and into the shadows. We glaze this into the highlights to make the white appear more smooth and pure, while we glaze it into the shadows to dilute the border between shadow and brightness, thus giving us a very smooth, crispy white. Do not apply this as a wash, just a very thin layer into the shadows and the brightest highlights. For our next step, we will be using Vallejo metal color Gunmetal Grey to paint all of our metallic details. I will be using the plastic side of my wet palette to dilute this pigment and mix it in. I love this paint because it applies in one coat even over white color, which is not a very good color to use when painting metallics. When applying this color, you can mostly be pretty free and liberal in your application. I mean, we're painting a medieval knight. They did have a lot of metal parts in their armor. However, the one thing you need to be mindful of is of the white. If you smear this on the white paint, you can fix it, of course, but it will take you a long time, as white is difficult to layer almost over any color you can think of, especially metallic pigment. Next up, we will be tackling the browns in our color scheme. Now, while I use specific Vallejo paints, and in this step we're using Vallejo Flat Brown, you have a freedom of choice here. You can use any brown paint you like, but make sure it's consistent with the color of leather. Here I'm picking out the Under Armour, basically, the Brigandine, some leather armor, and his skirt. This will take a couple coats to apply, as layering any color over white will take extra time due to its opacity. So take your time and make sure you don't leave any white in the recesses where you don't need it, as that will show very much so when we apply the wash and at the end of painting. We don't have the advantage of painting over a black primer where you can just apply the paint and kind of skip the shadows. When painting over white, you want to make sure to cover all the shadow areas and the entire part that you're painting. Take extra time with this, and of course be careful around the white that we already painted. To diversify the color of the leather, we're going to use a different brown color. This time is chocolate brown from AK Interactive. The reason I'm doing this is to make the leather part stand out a little bit more. You don't want to use the same leather color on everything, even though it's a possibility that it was like this historically. We are still painting an art piece, so we want to make sure this will be interesting to the viewer in the end. For our third brown, we'll be using Rhinox Hide from Games Workshop Citadel line. This is just to pick out the boots. Again, I'm just doing this to make sure our browns look interesting and that we don't use the same brown for every leather part of the model. The choice is up to you if you would like to do that. We'll also be using this color to paint the fur around the knight's neck. Again, same reason. If we're using something on a leather armor piece, we don't want to use the same color on the fur as it might be confusing to the viewer. This is a good idea to do. Just choose different browns for different parts. Take your time when picking up this neck piece. You don't want to get the brown color on the white as it will stain and you will have to redo the whole work. Paint the black details, you really can use any black. Like you see here, I have an Army Painter and an AK Interactive. You can use whichever black you prefer working with. I'm gonna pick out the scabbard belt, the belt around his torso, and the handle of the sword. Take your time, don't get the black on the white. That will be very difficult to fix. Now for the fun part, we'll be picking out the classical look of the Teutonic Knights by painting in some feather sections in black. I'm gonna alternate these. I'm gonna start with the top, then middle, then bottom. Make sure they're roughly the same width and you can use the sculpted feathers as a guide. Take your time with this technique. Always pre-plan which feathers you're gonna pick out black, as if you pick out a feather, let's say that you wanted to keep white, it's gonna take you a while to restore that white color. So take your time, plan ahead, and enjoy. Make sure you color in the top and side of the crest as well as the other side. Take your time, make sure they're evenly spaced so that you don't have a black section that is wider on the back compared to the front. This is an optional step, however I really do think this adds character to our knight. Here's how my helmet crest came out. Feel free to use this for your reference. Our final part that we're gonna base coat is going to be the spear haft. For this I'm using Old Wood by Vallejo Panzer Aces. To bring everything together and give the model some depth, we're gonna be applying a shade. The first shade I'm going to be using is Agrax Earthshade by Games Workshop, however Strong Tone by Army Painter is a great alternative. This is done to add quick shadows and depth to our objects. Now when applying this you want to avoid two things. You want to of course avoid getting this color on the white robes and also getting it on the metallic parts. Why? Because we're going to be using a dark wash on the metal and we don't really want our chainmail and metal parts to look kind of dirty and grimy like this, as I would assume a Knight Templar would keep his armor in good standing. So, however, if you would like his armor to look a little bit beaten up and a little bit rusty even, you can apply this all over the entire miniature, of course, except for the white parts. And finally, to add depth to our metallic parts, we'll be using Basilicanum Grey from Games Workshop, a contrast paint. You don't need to do anything with it, I applied it straight out of the bottle. This will give our metal parts some good depth and also reduce the shine of it, which we will restore later with layering Gunmetal Grey. Make sure to apply it in a thin layer, don't let it pull too much, however if it does, it's very easy to fix. Our main goal with doing this is to add depth and contrast to the metallic parts. Take your time, don't rush it, apply it and let the miniature dry for at least an hour before proceeding. After the wash is dry, we're just gonna apply a very small detail, which is some gold to the tips of the horns. I feel this will kind of add some character and as well maybe demark this footman as a veteran. You can also apply this on the decorative element of the Great Helm. Again, just kind of making him look a little bit unique, making him stand out next to his brethren. Maybe this guy's a veteran and he could afford some metal gold engraving on his helmet. Our next step for painting the leather will be to use flat brown and flat earth. We'll use flat brown to re-establish the color on the areas that were shaded previously, giving them more depth. Then we will paint with flat earth to highlight the panels. When I say highlight, we're just gonna pick out the edges, being extra careful. I will be using my size 0 Kolinsky sable brush to paint this. This just helps me kind of retain more control of the paint, as well as not worrying about painting too thick of a line. Now, if you do paint a thick line, or you don't like how the highlight looks, you can always come back to flat brown to thin it out, or remove it entirely. Next, we will use flat earth to highlight even more to add more contrast. Now, this line should be thinner than your previous line and fully contained within the previous line. What this means is this line will be thinner and closer to the edge of the armor panels. If you're not comfortable doing this step, you can skip it as it's optional and just adds more contrast. Next, we will re-establish the color in our chocolate brown leather segments. Now for this, the same manner of application. Apply it all over the previously painted area except for the recesses and shadows. Since I don't have a brighter color that's going to be appropriate for highlighting this, I'll mix in some pale sand in a 1:1 ratio to create our edge highlighting color. The principle of application is the same as on the Brigandine, just apply it over the very edges, keeping the lines thin and neat. If you do make a line that's too thick or you don't like how it looks, you can always come back to chocolate brown to even out the line or completely remove it. To highlight the leather pants, we're going to be using a mix of pale sand and flat earth. Again, use this sparingly and apply it in thin lines. Always remember you can correct your mistakes with the original color. If you accidentally painted in a shadow, you can always just grab pure black and re-establish the panel line. Next up, Gorthor Brown to highlight our fur. Now here you just keep the brush perpendicular to what you're painting and just carefully pick out all of the individual furs. Alternatively, you can just keep your brush parallel to the structure and just gently brush over it with a small amount of paint. It will pick up those details nice and evenly for you. Whatever you do, take your time and make sure not to get it on the white. For the spear, highlight it towards the tip, leaving somewhat of a darker color towards the haft of the spear. Don't forget to pick up the metal studs on the shoes and the Brigandine. Don't forget it, it's gonna look very cool. For the helmet, Highlight all of the areas that are visible to the light source, and also keeping the shadows in the recesses and between different details, like for example the decorative gold element that we've painted. And lastly, the top of the helmet. You can do a fancy little gradient there by just painting it towards the front of the helmet, or just paint the entire area, as I would imagine it would catch the entire light source and be quite shiny. And same principle for the back of the helmet. Just paint it where the light catches the detail, avoiding the shadow in the separation of the top and bottom of the helmet, as well as the panel lines. Be careful not to get it on the fur. Finally, we're gonna highlight all of our metal parts using Gunmetal Grey. Here you just want to pick out all of the areas that are towards the light. For example, on his chainmail jacket, just pick up the tops of the arms, or the parts that are obviously going to be hit by our light source, such as the finger over his spear, the shoulders, the bends in his arms. Now to highlight our last detail on the helmet, we'll be using Brass by AK Interactive to pick out those gold decorative elements on the horns, as well as the front facing plate of his helmet. Apply this, leaving a small amount of the previous paint in the shadows. As gold is a naturally shiny color, you don't need too much shadow here. We're gonna highlight all of the black details, including the feathers, the sword strap, and the belt, by mixing in a gray color of your choosing. When painting the feathers, apply this towards the ends of the feathers that are facing outwards. I suggest going a little bit brighter here, since we do have to fight against the brightness of the white color next to it. Carefully highlight the areas, making sure you don't get it on the white. Now for the fun or scary part, depending on what you prefer, we're gonna paint the freehand design on the shield. When painting a simple freehand design like this, mark out an area where you're gonna paint the main design. In this case, I'm using two thin lines to demarcate where I'm gonna paint the horizontal part of the cross and the vertical part of the cross. Start by filling in those two lines with a black color that you've diluted pretty thinly for easier control. Keep working on it until you have an even design. Unfortunately, I don't have much tips for freehanding other than keep your paint thin, get a smaller brush, and take your time. You can always fix mistakes with the original color. The tricky part to painting a cross design is to make sure that both of the sides of the horizontal line are even and going in the same direction. Just take your time. You can use a pencil to mark out the areas if you wish so. I've seen some people use masking tape, but for me it's just a little bit too time consuming. Here's our miniature ready for basing. So far so good. It's the miniature. I'll be using a textured paint from Games Workshop called Agrax Earth. Once you apply the paste, give it plenty of time to dry. This can take up to an hour and a half. Once the paste is dry, apply a little bit of a wash. I'm gonna be using Agrax Earthshade here to give it some more depth and contrast. Finally, dry brush the base with a light brown color. In this case, I'll be using Gorthor Brown from Games Workshop. Lightly dry brush the area by moving the bristles of the brush against the grain of the textured paste. This will catch the edges and raise the areas and give us a nice bright color. And if you wish, you can apply some static grass tufts at the end. Finally, paint the rim of your base black, or any color you desire, and with that, we are done. Hope you enjoyed, and see you again soon.